conferencia inaugural.
Bueno, buenos días. Muchas gracias por la oportunidad de estar aquí. Es mi primera vez en Ecuador y para mí es un país muy interesante y muy hermoso. Pero, lo siento, puedo no hablar más en español. Eso es todo. Muy nerviosa. Anyway, thank you for putting up with that. I thought I should try. So I'm very happy to be here and to have this opportunity to share some of my thinking with you. I'm from Davis, which is in Northern California, about halfway between San Francisco and Lake Tahoe, and about a 10-hour drive from San Diego. And when you are at the Pan Am Congress in 2025 in San Diego, I hope you have the opportunity to visit some of the beautiful places that California is famous for. California is also famous for its freeways. So we have lots of freeways, we have lots of drivers, we have lots of cars, and we have lots of people, and all of that adds up to a lot of driving every year. We measure driving as vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, and I'm going to talk a lot about VMT. California is also famous for its climate policy. We have very ambitious goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions that we adopted almost 20 years ago. And of course, because passenger cars make up 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions, there's a lot of focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. So California is also famous for its very ambitious targets for converting from internal combustion engines to zero-emission vehicles. We have one of the most ambitious goals for converting to zero-emission vehicles in the world. And we are making good progress. Electric vehicles make up a growing segment of car sales in California. And if you drive around California, you will see Teslas everywhere. But the analysis shows that converting to zero-emission vehicles will not be enough for the state to meet its goals for reducing vehicle miles of travel. So the state has also set targets for reducing vehicle miles of travel for each of the metropolitan regions. And it requires, the state requires the regional transportation planning agencies to adopt regional transportation plans that demonstrate how the region will meet its target for reducing vehicle miles of travel. But if you take a look at those plans and what's in them, you'll find a lot of projects to widen our highway system, to add capacity to our highway system, including a project to widen the interstate freeway that runs through my city of Davis. So that's the question. Why is California widening freeways at the same time that it is trying to reduce driving? California is not the only place where you find this sort of contradictory thinking, where on one hand we're continuing to do what we have traditionally done, which is to add to the highway capacity. But you also find a lot of places where the thinking has shifted, where we are investing in the alternatives to driving and trying to reduce dependence on driving. And you can also find a lot of places where we're doing both at the same time. So this makes it a very interesting moment in transportation, probably the most interesting moment in my now rather long career. And this has been very interesting to me, and so I've been doing a lot of thinking about this. And I think to understand this interesting moment, what we need to do is look below the surface and take a look at how the profession is thinking about what its job is. So my thesis, and what I'm going to talk to you about today, is first that the ideas embraced by the transportation profession at any moment in time shape the transportation system in fundamental ways. So it's important to understand what those ideas are. And second, that the ideas that have traditionally dominated the profession over the last century are shifting toward a new way of thinking that if we actually make that shift, that the ideas that the profession has traditionally embraced have been shifting toward a new way of thinking. And that new way of thinking could lead to a very different kind of transportation system. So that's what I would like to talk to you about today. I should start by defining what do I mean by the transportation profession. And that's a little more challenging than you might think. The boundaries of what counts as the profession are a little fuzzy, but I include in this the employees of federal, state, regional, and local agencies who do the work and make the decisions about the transportation system, that operate the transportation system on a daily basis. But of course also the consultants that are hired by these agencies, the professional associations to which these employees belong. And I include academics as a part of the profession, because it's nice to think that the work we do has an influence on the work that these employees are doing. So that's the profession, and I include myself as a part of this. And when I talk about the profession, or I say we, I'm including myself. Okay, so if you look below the surface, you find a set of ideas that have been really important to the profession over the last century. And these are not the only ideas that are important. These are ideas that I have found to be particularly important and particularly interesting for one reason or another. And if you think about all of these ideas, really what they add up to is an approach that's about trying to make it easier to drive. That's really what the profession has been focused on. And then you can see that these ideas are embedded in the key guidance for the profession. So documents like the Highway Capacity Manual, the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, otherwise known as the MUTCD, and then what we call the Green Book, the Policy on Geometric Design of Highways and Streets. But if you take a look at the most recent versions of these guidance documents, you start to see some significant change in thinking reflected in the new versions of these documents. In other words, we may have a little crack in the pavement, and in fact, for every one of these traditional ideas, there is an alternative idea that is gaining traction in the profession. These alternative ideas are not, for the most part, new ideas. They've been around as long as the traditional ideas, but they never had the same sort of acceptance within the profession. So that's where the shift becomes really interesting, as these alternative ideas gain acceptance and become more prominent within the profession and are thus influencing what we're doing with the transportation system. And if you think about these alternative ideas, really what they add up to is the goal of making it easier and safer to not drive. Okay. So I don't have time to talk about all of these ideas today, so I'm going to pick and choose. And since I started out by talking about widening freeways, I'm going to start with this idea of capacity. massive. The idea that it is our job as a transportation profession to provide enough capacity to accommodate the demand. The transportation profession, this was a big goal of theirs from the start. So we started by using an observe and provide approach. We looked at where is there congestion, where do we need more capacity. That evolved into the predict and provide approach, and we developed travel demand forecasting models that let us look at where congestion is likely to be in the future, and we could anticipate that in advance and provide capacity in those places. But that approach ignored the fact that when you add capacity, you also induce additional travel, what we call the induced travel effect. Officials recognized this as far back as the 1920s when we first started expanding our roadway network and developed the concept of freeways. But for the most part, this was ignored. By now, we have lots of robust research that essentially proves that this phenomenon exists, and that for the most part, on average, every 10% increase in roadway capacity is going to lead to a 10% increase in vehicle miles of travel. In other words, it's an elasticity. But still, this has been a hard idea for the profession to accept. My team at UC Davis, we took that research and we developed a very simple, what we call a induced travel calculator that can be used to estimate the increase in vehicle miles of travel for any proposed highway widening project in California. And now our California Department of Transportation has approved the use of this calculator in the official environmental review process. And I will just say that it's been an interesting couple of years, and we are not very well liked among the officials who are trying to widen highways in California because they're not very happy about how much additional VMT our calculator says that their project will generate, because then they have to mitigate that in some way. So there's still a lot of resistance to this idea of induced travel, and everyone argues that, well, yes, maybe that's a thing, but it doesn't apply to my freeway. My freeway is not going to be generating travel. My freeway is going to be reducing congestion. There's a little bit of backtracking on that idea, however. There's actually a freeway in Southern California that had been planned for a couple of decades that recently got canceled. They decided they were not going to build this freeway after all. That was a very revolutionary thing to do. We never cancel freeway projects, so that was really the big deal. And then, of course, the alternative idea to adding capacity is that maybe instead what we should be doing is managing demand. And here too, we're starting to see some shift in thinking, where after a couple of decades of debate, New York City is finally on the verge of adopting congestion pricing. So that's a really big deal and reflects a really big change in thinking. Okay, now when we're talking about adding capacity, of course what we're talking about is adding capacity for vehicles. And here the underlying idea is that, this is the responsibility of the profession, that we should be maximizing vehicle throughput, that we should be accommodating cars. Well, cars are big, and they're getting bigger in the US. People are increasingly buying pickup trucks and sport utility vehicles, but even regular cars are getting bigger and heavier, and that has really important implications. One is safety, thinking about what this means for people who are outside of vehicles. And research shows that this increasing vehicle size is contributing to an increase in pedestrian fatalities that we've seen in recent years. But bigger vehicles are also simply a problem from the standpoint of space. Cars are not a very efficient way to move people from the standpoint of space. A car moving a single person takes up a whole lot more space than any other mode of transportation. In the US, our average vehicle occupancy is not very much more than 1. So it's a very inefficient use of our space. And so many communities are starting to appreciate that maybe all of that space we've devoted to cars could be better used in other ways. Road diets have become very popular, where you take a street that maybe 4 or 5 lanes for cars, and you reallocate that space so that you give some of that space to bicycles and to transit, and maybe you have a turn lane in the middle, and you cut it down to 2 lanes of car traffic. So we're seeing lots of these projects in the US. In other parts of the world, they've gone much farther than this. So Barcelona, very famous for its superblock system, where they've taken streets and made them public spaces used by pedestrians and bicyclists. Even in the US, we've seen some change in thinking about this, in part thanks to COVID, where we thought about, well, maybe we should be using our streets for other purposes, like for people to get out and exercise, or for outdoor dining, whatnot. So we saw lots of these projects around the US. Some of them were temporary, but some of them have become permanent. And again, it reflects a change in thinking about the degree to which we should be accommodating cars versus the degree to which we should be thinking about people and their needs. It helps that we have research that supports these efforts. Research, for example, that shows the cost of devoting so much space to cars in the US. We tend to build very wide, excessively wide streets, which adds to housing costs. We also have research showing the benefits of converting some of that space to use by other modes. So, for example, taking out parking and converting that space to bicycle lane can actually be good for the local businesses. And then where we maybe made the most progress of all in the US is with respect to thinking about parking. We have traditionally had minimum parking requirements for every development, whether it's business or residential, and that has contributed to an excess of parking. And again, communities are starting to understand the impact that that has, and that that's an opportunity cost. That's land that we're devoting to parking cars as opposed to other uses like housing. So in a lot of places, these minimum parking requirements are being removed. So again, a significant change in thinking. Okay, now capacity for vehicles is really all about mobility, making it easier for cars to move. The corollary to that idea is that congestion is bad, and congestion is a problem that we need to solve. So again, very much embedded in the way we traditionally approach transportation. Congestion is bad. Nobody likes being stuck in traffic. There's lots of research that shows all the negative impacts of congestion. So of course it makes sense that this is something that we would want to address. We use this level of service measure, which is really just a function of volume to capacity, as one of our key performance measures for the transportation system. And this simple little idea has really driven most of our transportation decision-making in the US, I would venture to say, including those highway widening projects. It's all about improving level of service and reducing congestion. But is moving cars more easily really the goal? The alternative way to think about this is that no, it's not. The goal is not to just move people, it's to get people to where they need to go. And that's where the idea of accessibility becomes maybe a more promising and more legitimate alternative. So as early as the 1950s, people like Lewis Mumford were talking about this, that there was too much focus on moving vehicles and not enough focus on thinking about what it is that people really needed. The fact that transportation is simply a means to the end. So this idea has gained a lot of popularity, at least in transportation planning circles. You may have heard of the idea of a 15-minute city, which has been adopted around the world. This is a nice way to think about what we mean by accessibility. Can we put most of what people need within a shorter distance, in which case they are less dependent on driving and congestion becomes more irrelevant to their lives. So a lot of thought about moving towards this model of development. The challenge is that takes a shift in thinking about transportation, but also I think a shift in thinking about land use planning. That accessibility depends on both of those things. And of course, the transportation profession does not have a role in land use planning, at least the way our institutions are structured in the US. So this has been an ongoing challenge to solving our transportation problems, is that we separate transportation planning from land use planning. And this accessibility idea argues for bringing those back together. All right, now, mobility is about ease of movement for vehicles. We also then need to talk about the idea of speed. And of course, we as humans, we like speed. We like the thrill of speed. We ride roller coasters. We like going fast. But as a profession, we also like speed. We define efficiency in terms of speed. The system is efficient if we get people quickly to where they need to go. So let's think about that. Well, of course, one issue is that speeds have implications for safety. So you may have seen graphics like this that depict how much worse it is for pedestrians and others on the street if the cars are going faster. Faster speeds mean more safety concerns, more injuries, more fatalities. So we regulate speed through speed limits. In the US, we set speed limits according to the 85th percentile rule, which in effect means that the drivers are setting their own speed limits. We base the speed on how quickly people are driving. The alternative would be to say, here's how fast we want cars to be going, because this is what we think is appropriate for this kind of environment, and we're concerned about safety, and we could set speeds accordingly. So there is some movement away from this 85th percentile rule approach to setting speed limits, and towards this alternative approach where we think about what do we think are the appropriate speeds. A lot of communities in the US have taken on these 20 is plenty campaigns, 20 miles per hour is plenty fast for a residential area. And again, that's a big change in thinking, that what's appropriate is to slow cars down. Now, of course, it's hard to get people to drive more slowly when we design roads for cars to go fast. So lots of our design guidelines say roads should be straight, lanes should be wide, we should have wide clear zones at the edge of roads. And if you design that way, you may reduce the risk of crashes happening, but you're also encouraging faster speeds. And faster speeds are going to make those crashes worse. So we've got this conflict in our approach to designing roads and our goals with respect to safety. So what do? We implement traffic calming as a way to make up for the poor design choices we've made about our roadways. These techniques are designed to slow cars down, make the environment safer for pedestrians and bicyclists. And we've actually been doing this for a long time in the US. This is not so new. Almost every community has some form of traffic calming. But really what it reflects is the poor design of the streets to begin with. And an even more radical idea is the idea that maybe slow is not only not so bad, but maybe slow is actually good. So again, these slow streets movements that were so popular during COVID have led to some shift in thinking, at least for residential areas. That picture on the right, I included that, those are two of my former students who were riding the train one day between Sacramento and the San Francisco Bay Area, and just happened to bump into each other on the train after not seeing each other for several years. So of course they had to take a selfie and send it to me. But I think this is a great example of how sometimes the slower modes, and the train is a little slower than driving still in our area, has many other advantages. This kind of chance meeting would never have happened if they had been driving instead. So slow can be good, and maybe that's something we should think about and embrace. Okay, but if we talk about slowing people down, we start to bump into the idea of freedom. This is a really core idea for Americans, as you may know. We like to talk about the freedom of the open road, and everyone loves going on road trips. And it is true that the car gives you the ability to go where and when you want. It does give us some level of freedom, but maybe not as much freedom as we like to think. So for one thing, cars are, of course, very expensive to own and maintain. We don't always stop and think about that cost. Most households in the US own a car, and even when we're talking about the lower income households with incomes below $25,000 a year, 75% of those households own a car. So that's a huge financial burden, but they do it because they feel like they have no choice. That the car is the only way they're going to be able to get to work and do the things that they need to do in their daily lives. So cars give us freedom, but they are also a huge burden, and we should not forget that. And then I also worry that the focus on cars as freedom, the way we think about cars as freedom, obscures the fact that not everyone has equal freedom of movement. So there's been a lot of talk in recent years about how brown people and black people in the US are disproportionately stopped by police when they are driving, but it also happens when they're walking and biking. So their freedom of movement is severely restricted in our country. And then around the world, we know that women's freedom of movement is also often very much restricted over concerns over personal security. So a lot of research looking at the experience of women in transit systems. So cars, freedom, yeah, sure, but we need to really think about freedom in a much broader way. And so I really like this idea of mobility justice, which is catching on in the US, which is a very broad concept that encompasses the idea that we've got to make sure that everybody has some equitable level of movement and access, but that we also need to think about the wrongs that were done in the past. So when we built freeways in the US in the old days, what neighborhoods did they go through? They went through the brown and black neighborhoods. And then we also need to think about the process by which decisions, transportation decisions are made, and make sure that communities are having an adequate say in the decisions about their own transportation systems. Okay, then the last idea I want to touch on is technology. And this ties very much to freedom because we like to think that, okay, technology is going to solve all our problems. We don't have to give up the freedom of the car. We can use technology to fix things. And the profession has a long tradition of believing in the power of technology to solve our problems. The public, too, likes to think that technology can solve the problems, that we can have our cake and eat it, too, if you know that expression. So, of course, technology has made a big difference, and our cars are much better than they used to be with respect to air quality, as well as safety. Not that we don't have more work to do, but we've come a long way, so that's a great thing. But, you know, there are a lot of technologies that were promised as being the solution to everything, that didn't really pan out that way, of course, so it doesn't always work. There's some technologies that are being promised to us now that I don't believe we are ever going to have, like the Hyperloop. Electric vehicles, as I mentioned, you know, this is really an important part of our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, and we are making a lot of progress here. But electric vehicles are still cars, and they're very heavy cars, so we still have safety problems. And of course, these cars still need roads, and we need to maintain those roads, and doing that also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. So electric vehicles, an important development, but again, not the solution to all of our problems. What about autonomous vehicles? Well, I'm a skeptic. You know, I think there are lots of ways this technology can help, especially with respect to safety, but still lots of questions about what these technologies are going to do for people outside of the vehicles, and also questions about is this simply going to support more driving with all of the problems that creates. So time will tell. But I'm a big believer that our old technologies, new versions of our old technologies, are going to be a really important part of our transportation future. Whether we're talking about transit, biking, walking, scooters, whatever. That these older modes that were around 100 years ago and more still have a very important part to play in our transportation system. Bike share systems, for example, are exploding around the world. Ridership up a lot in recent years. Electric assist bikes or e-bikes, this is one of my favorite ideas. Electric bike sales took off during COVID in the US, and in fact there were more e-bike sales than there were electric vehicle sales. That's so much potential for this technology to help with some of our transportation problems. And then you can put those two things together and have bike sharing systems that rent e-bikes. We studied the system in Sacramento and showed that our data showed that, in fact, yes, the system was leading to a reduction in driving, and along with that, of course, a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Another thing our research shows is that people really like riding e-bikes. We call this the fun factor. And this might sound a little silly, but it's really important because if we want people to change their behavior, fun is going to be really helpful. If people have fun doing something other than driving, there's more chance that they're going to do it. And then, of course, there are also e-cargo bikes, and I'm going to point you to my colleague, Miguel, who's here, who's doing some research on e-bikes as a way to take care of some of our last mile delivery challenges. Okay, so future mobility, technology is an important part of that, but I think we have to remember that technology is not deterministic. Technology, in fact, is what some of my colleagues call a social construct. We get to decide what we do with that technology, right? So it's up to us. And so we really need to be thinking about what are the goals as we look at the technologies that are coming along. So, you know, we can go driverless if this is what we choose, or we can go driverless and think about it in a completely different way. So it's up to us. All right, so just to wrap up, I think it's clear that we are seeing a pretty fundamental shift in ideas in the profession, at least in the US, but I think in other parts of the world as well. For some of these ideas, the shift is farther along and more robust. And don't read too much into my orange arrows, those are just approximate, not anything that I've actually measured. But it's a really, really important shift in thinking. The question is, you know, when is it enough? When do we get enough shift that we have what's called a paradigm shift? where we actually give up the old way of thinking about it, where the goal was to make it easier to drive. And we shift to this new way where we think about making it easier to not drive, as we set that as the goal. Are we there yet? I don't think so. I've been using the same slide for about 10 years now, and I think we're getting closer, but we still have a ways to go. And I'm still seeing a lot of what I referred to at the beginning of my talk, where you have the traditional approach happening at the same time that you have the new approach. That we've got this sort of muddled thinking that I call throw everything at it. And of course, the it is still congestion, and I see that as a problem. But the idea that, okay, we need to add road capacity while we're adding new transit service and improving the alternatives to driving. And, that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? I don't think we're going to solve anything by doing all of it. We've really got to focus on thinking about transportation in a new way. So that's what I recommend, is that the profession do some deep thinking about its thinking. That it takes a look at the core ideas that underlie our approach to transportation and reconsider those. And maybe these new ideas have a role to play in our profession. So I hope my talk has sparked some new thinking for all of you. And I look forward to the next few days to hearing your ideas about transportation and driving professionals with you guys. So. I'm not sure when I started.